Welcome back, viewers. I'm Dr. Surbhi Unial and I teach philosophy at the School of Liberal Arts, Bennett University. We are doing a lecture series on Indian knowledge system, and in today's lecture we are talking about the notion of moksha in the Indian tradition. We have talked about the etymology of the term moksha and how historically the concept has developed from the Vedas to the Upanishad and to the various philosophical schools. We are talking about dharma as one of the four purusharths, wherein dharma is considered to be the righteous action or the righteous duty, and this righteousness and duty is established and establishes the ethical foundation which is necessary for the spiritual progress. The other being earth and kam, wherein earth means material prosperity, and this material prosperity is considered to be legitimate worldly needs and the importance of economic stability in creating conditions which will be conducive to spiritual practice. Then we also talked about kam, which signifies pleasure or emotional fulfillment, and how this emotional fulfillment recognizes the natural human need for joy, beauty, love and sensory satisfaction as a part of a balanced life. And then ultimately moksha stands for the end goal that gives meaning to all other pursuits, representing the transcendence of limited identification while potentially including and transforming the other three goals. So, earth, kam, done in the guidance of dharma, eventually leads to liberation. So, it is an integration rather than rejection of worldly life. So, dharma, earth, kam, they become the stepping stone to moksha. So, moksha cannot be attained without earth, kam and dharma. Herein, once earth, kam and dharma are realized, that would then lead to moksha. So, they become the stepping stone of moksha when pursued with wisdom and detachment. So, which emphasizes that earth and kam done in guidance with dharma would then eventually lead to liberation. But then what are the path of liberation, or what are the various ways in which liberation can be attained? So, the Indian tradition, it recognizes four primary paths to moksha. So, the first is karma yoga or karma marg. So, the path of action which emphasizes performing one's duties without attachment to results, gradually purifying the mind and ego through selfless service and right action. That is called karma yoga. So, the path wherein action done without any kind of attachment to the results, then eventually it purifies the mind and ego through selfless service and right action. That leads to liberation. So, one of the path to liberation is the path to action or path of action in performing one's righteous duties. Before going to the next path, this path of karma, basically, if we try to understand it deeper, this path recognizes that action is unavoidable, but it teaches how to act without creating new bondage, ultimately leading to a state where action becomes worship and where every deed becomes an offering to the divine. So, here this type of action that we are basically focusing upon is the action which is a detached action, and this ultimately leading to a state where action becomes a worship, because it's like surrendering to the divine. So doing your action as an offering to the divine, that is the path of karma. The next is Bhakti Yoga or Bhakti Marg, which is a path of devotion, cultivates intense love and surrender to the divine, allowing the heart to be purified through devotion, prayer and chanting and the religious worships. This path recognizes that love is the most powerful force for transformation, and that complete surrender to the divine can dissolve the ego and lead to union with the beloved. So the Bhakti Yoga and the path to devotion, it cultivates, it's basically related to love and surrendering to the divine. And in surrendering to the divine, we dissolve the ego and lead to the union with the beloved. Then comes Gyan Yoga or Gyan Marg, which is a path of knowledge. It involves systematic inquiry into the nature of reality through study, contemplation and direct discrimination between the real and the unreal. This intellectual path uses reason and intuition to penetrate the veil of appearance and realize the true nature of existence. So in the Gyan Yoga or Gyan Marg, which uses the path of knowledge, and in the path of knowledge, it basically realizes the ignorance and removes and penetrates the veil of this ignorance and appearance and realize the true nature of existence through the right knowledge. So the knowledge basically becomes the path wherein one, with the help of reason and intuition, they go deeper and remove the veil of appearance and ignorance, and in doing so they realize the true nature of existence. The fourth is Raj Yoga, which is the royal path. It combines elements of all other paths through systematic meditation practices, ethical purification and the cultivation of one-pointed concentration, leading to samadhi states, where the meditation and the object of meditation merge into the unity. So this marg or this path to liberation integrates, or you can say brings together all other paths. How they are brought together is through a systematic meditation practices, also through ethical purification and the cultivation of one-pointed concentration. And this concentration in its more specified state then leads to samadhi state. And in that samadhi state, there becomes a unity of the one who is meditating, the process of meditation and the object of meditation. They all merge into a unity, and that is where one realizes the state of moksha or liberation. Now with these paths in mind, all these four paths of liberation or moksha, let us now look at different philosophical schools. What are their notion of moksha and how can it be attained? Starting with Nyaya Vaisheshikas. For Nyaya Visheshikas, moksha is known as apavarg, which is a state of complete cessation of pain and rebirth. The root cause of bondage is philosophical ignorance, which is called avidya. This ignorance leads to wrong actions, which is bad karma, which in turn brings suffering and repeated births. Liberation is achieved by reversing this cycle through true knowledge, which is called tattva gyan. So, in the Nyaya Visheshikas, the path of liberation can be seen as the tattva gyan, which is through the true knowledge one can achieve liberation. Because liberation here is considered to be a complete cessation of pain and rebirth. And they are saying that this pain and rebirth is caused through bondage. That bondage happens because of ignorance. And how this ignorance can be removed? This ignorance can be removed through the right knowledge, which is the tattva gyan. So, liberation is attained through valid knowledge, which is called Brahma, and logical analysis, presenting moksha as the complete elimination of pain through right knowledge of reality's 16 categories. Visheshikas, they focus on understanding reality through atomic theory and the categories of existence. So, viewing moksha as the soul's freedom from both pleasure and pain through knowledge of fundamental substances and their relationship. And that is how Nyaya and Vaisheshikas talk about the idea of liberation and moksha. Now, talking about Sankhya. Sankhya represents moksha as Kaivalya, which is the absolute isolation and discrimination of consciousness, which is Purush, from matter, which is Prakriti, achieved through clear understanding that Purush is inactive, unchanging, or witness consciousness that has never actually been bound. So, if we talk about moksha from the Sankhya perspective, is basically the isolation or the absolute isolation that they talk about, or discriminating between pure consciousness, which is Purush, and the matter, Prakriti. So, realizing that this distinction between Purush and Prakriti, and ultimately realizing the pure consciousness, is moksha for Sankhya, wherein one realizes the ultimate consciousness as distinct from the Prakriti or from the matter. Yoga, building on Sankhya metaphysics, defines moksha as the cessation of mental modification, which is called Chitta Vritti Nirodh, through systematic 8-limbed, which is the Ashtanga Yoga practice, emphasizing experiential realization over mere philosophical understanding. So, if you look at the path of liberation from the yogic perspective or from the yoga philosophical perspective, it also takes the ideas or the metaphysical ideas from Sankhya, being a sister school. They share the metaphysics, and doing so they define moksha as the cessation of mental modification, and this mental modification, the Chitta Vritti Nirodh, would then eventually make an individual realize the pure consciousness, the Purush, as distinct from the Prakriti. So, it is through the Chitta Vritti Nirodh that one realizes the pure consciousness as distinct from the Prakriti. And how is that done? So, the process of eightfold limbs, or you can say Ashtang Yoga, through those Ashtang yogic practices, one can eventually lead to liberation, wherein the state of Samadhi makes oneself in union with the Supreme Consciousness, which is the Purush, and see it as distinct from Prakriti, and that can be attained through these removal of these mental modifications. Then in Purva Mimamsa, if we talk about, they emphasizes on dharmic actions and Vedic rituals as path to moksha, presenting liberation as a natural result of perfectly performed duties without selfish motivation. So, it is in the Mimamsakas that the emphasis on dharmic action and Vedic rituals as a path to moksha has been emphasized. And these Vedic rituals have to be performed as duties without any selfish motives, which would eventually lead to liberation. Then the Uttar Mimamsa, which is Vedant, offers the most systematic concept of moksha, or you can say moksha philosophy, through its three main sub-schools. Advaita, if we talk about, sees liberation as recognizing the non-dual identity of Atman and Brahman. And it says, Brahma Satya Jagat Mithya Jiva Brahmano Napara, which means that Brahman is the only reality. The world is illusion, and the individual self is not different from Brahman. So, this is the idea which is proposed by the Advaita philosophy, which sees the non-duality between the Atman and the Brahman, and it says that it is the Brahman alone which is the reality. The world is an illusion, and the individual self is not different from the Brahman. So, here moksha, attaining moksha, is seeing the union of the individual self with the ultimate reality, which is Brahman. So, this captures the essence of non-dualism. Only Brahman is real, the world is transient, and liberation comes by realizing the unity of self and the Brahman. If we talk about Vishisht Advaita, it presents moksha as a qualified non-dualism, where individual souls, they realize their essential dependence on Brahman while maintaining subtle distinctions. And Dvaita maintains eternal loving relationship between individual soul and the Supreme Person as the highest liberation. So, we can see that even within the Vedantic philosophy, the different schools of Vedanta provide different understanding of liberation depending on their metaphysical theories. So, there are subtle differences between the different schools of Vedanta. Now, if we talk about the Buddhist concept of moksha, or what they call as nirvana. So, Buddhism's nirvana transcends the very notion of permanent self to the liberated, focusing instead on the cessation of suffering through understanding, emptiness and dependent origination. Buddhist philosophy, as we know, is centered around four noble truths, which are that there is dukkha, which is suffering, then there is dukkha samudaya, which is the cause of suffering, which is craving, trishna, attachment and ignorance. Then there is dukkha nirodha, which is suffering can end by eliminating its causes. And then there is a path, which is marg, which leads to the end of suffering. And this marg they have emphasized on the noble eightfold path, and through this noble eightfold path we can put an end to suffering. So these are the four noble truths in Buddhism, which tells us that there is suffering, there is a cause of suffering, but this suffering will end. So there is an end to suffering or cessation of suffering. How? We can follow a path which will eventually lead to the removal of suffering, and this path is called the Eightfold Noble Path, which will eventually lead to the elimination of suffering. So here again we can see that how in Buddhism the ultimate truth is that there is suffering, and liberation would then means that how we can put an end to this suffering. Through the 12 causal link, through the eightfold path and through these four noble truths, they try to understand and propose the concept of moksha, that how the reality is that there is suffering and how that can be removed, and then how moksha can be attained. And realizing the moksha means putting an end to suffering and putting an end to be born again, because if one is born again or rebirth takes place, then it will eventually lead to suffering, because that is the truth, that is the ultimate truth, that if you are born, you are meant to suffer. Talking about Jain or Jainism, how it presents moksha as the soul's complete purification from karmic bondage through the three jewels of right belief, right knowledge and right conduct, emphasizing ethical perfection and non-violence as essential elements of liberation. So in Jainism basically they try to understand moksha as the complete purification, and this complete purification from the karmic bondage, which will take place with the three ratna or three jewels, which are known as right belief, right knowledge and right conduct, which will then eventually lead to liberation. So they emphasize on ethical perfection and non-violence as the elements of liberation. So Jain philosophy, moksha is the state of liberation where all karmas are completely destroyed and the soul exists in its original pure form. Then in the Charvak philosophy, if we talk about, which is strictly materialistic and atheistic, rejects the concept of moksha altogether. So it is only in the Charvak philosophy, if we see in a broader sense, which completely rejects the concept of moksha. Because Charvaks were materialist, they only believe in what can be perceived and what is there in the world. And therefore, they thought that end of the body is the end of life. So there is no rebirth, there is no transmigration, there is no afterbirth. It's only in this present life that we can talk about an individual. Once the body dies, the individual goes with the body. There is no concept of soul per se, because they only believe in body since they are materialists. So they reject the concept of moksha altogether. So with this we have seen that how different schools within the Indian tradition talks about the idea of liberation and moksha depending on their metaphysics and epistemology, and how this moksha can be attained. Now there are broadly two types of moksha or liberation if we talk about in Indian philosophical traditions. So these two types of moksha, which has been again taken up by different philosophical schools in different ways, they are basically Jivan Mukti and Vidhe Mukti. So the primary distinction which lies between Jivan Mukti, which is liberation while living, and Vidhe Mukti is the liberation after death. So Jivan Mukti, it represents the ideal of complete spiritual realization while still embodied, where the individual functions in the world but remains established in transcendent consciousness, free from identification with body, mind and circumstances. Vidhe Mukti on the other hand occurs when liberation is achieved only upon death of the physical body, representing cases where complete freedom is attained but some subtle identification with embodiment remains until physical dissolution. So these are the two types of mukti that we can talk about. So moksha stands as perhaps the most profound and transformative concept in human philosophical thought, representing not merely an ancient religious ideal, but a living possibility that addresses the deepest yearnings of the human consciousness. So moksha reminds us that while human suffering may be universal, it is not inevitable, and that each individual carries within themselves the capacity for complete freedom, unconditional love and perfect peace, whether understood as self-realization, divine union or the cessation of suffering. Moksha points towards the highest possibility of human existence and invites each of us to discover the truths of our own limitless nature. So with this we come to an end of our lecture on the idea of moksha in the Indian knowledge system. Thank you viewers, and we'll meet again. Thank you.